We've learnt what astrobiology is. It's always very useful in science if you want to get some perspective to understand the history, because the history of a subject can tell you how you've got to the place you're at the moment and what it was that led to the state of knowledge that we have today. So let's look at the history of astrobiology and get an overview of some of the early thoughts in this field and how it is that we've come to the state of knowledge that we understand about the possibilities of life beyond Earth today and our understandings of the history and evolution of life on Earth. You'll often hear people say astrobiology is a very new science, an emerging science. It's certainly true to say that astrobiology has developed very rapidly in recent years, and the experimental methods that are now being developed, new missions and new telescopes, are making this a subject that's advancing at a remarkable rate. But it's certainly not a new science. People have been contemplating the possibility of habitable worlds for a long time. This is a really rather remarkable statement by Metrodorus, an ancient Greek philosopher who was actually a student of Democritus, who first proposed the atomic theory of matter. And this is, in loose translation, what he said. He said, "It would be strange if a single ear of corn grew in a large plain, or there were only one habitable world in the infinite." Metrodorus was expressing the idea that if you go into a field, it's very unusual to see one ear of corn growing in the middle of a field with no other corn around it. Generally, if you go into a field and you see corn, you'll see a lot of it. And he wondered, if there is life on this planet, then surely there must be other worlds with life as well. Well, the ancient Greeks didn't quite have the same perception as the heavens that we do. They didn't understand about planets, and they didn't understand what the nature was of other stars. But nevertheless, this was a remarkable statement for people thinking in the early years of astrobiology over 2,000 years ago about the possibility of inhabited worlds. As we go on through history, we find other speculations that are just as remarkable. In the 16th century, during the Renaissance, this was a statement made by Giordano Bruno, who was an astronomer speculating about the possibility of planets beyond Earth. And it's worth reading what he said. He said, "In space there are countless constellations, suns and planets. We see only the suns because they give light. The planets remain invisible for they are small and dark. There are also numberless Earths circling around their suns." Now, if you think about this statement today, in an age where we are beginning to detect Earth-like planets around other stars, this is a truly remarkable speculation for the 16th century. I'm not a great fan of calling people fathers or mothers of particular fields of science. I don't think it does good things for the human ego. But if you really want a father of astrobiology, you would probably give it to Giordano Bruno, a person who speculated on the presence of other Earths orbiting other stars in the 16th century. Bruno, unfortunately, was burnt at the stake in 1600, not just for his astrobiological speculations. He did other things that incurred the wrath of his religious superiors. But he was the first astrobiologist, at least, to meet his fate, speculating, amongst other things, about life beyond Earth. The invention of the telescope allowed us to go beyond these speculations, to see planets around other stars and to start to form more empirical ideas about whether other planetary bodies could sustain life. And you might think that once the telescope had been invented, there would be a lot less speculation, because now we'd have real data about other planetary bodies on which we could base ideas and speculations. But in fact, remarkably, completely the opposite happens. Now we have telescopes, we can see other planetary bodies, but we don't have enough information to know what their environments are like. So now we've got all these new planets on which we can speculate about the presence of other life. And the invention of the telescope by Galileo, and you can see here one of the first images that he looked at, which was the moons of Jupiter, the 4 largest moons of Jupiter, now called the Galilean moons of Jupiter. This invention of the telescope and its widespread use led to the discovery of planets that caused speculation to run riot during the Enlightenment. This is a speculation by the famous scientist William Herschel, who wrote, whilst observing the moon, "By reflecting a little on this subject, I am almost convinced that those numberless small circuses we see on the moon are the works of the Lunarians and may be called their towns." Herschel was observing asteroid craters on the moon, craters that seemed almost perfectly circular, so circular they couldn't possibly have been formed by natural processes. They must be the work of an intelligence, and he believed that the moon might be inhabited by Lunarians who were constructing these fortifications on the moon. And even Christian Huygens, famous astronomer, observed spots on Venus, Mars and Jupiter, spots that we now know are features of storms and deserts on the surface of Mars. And he concluded there were clouds and water, and he stated, "The taste of music with the inhabitants of Venus and Jupiter is at a high level, similar to that of Frenchmen or Italians." Now, these observations today seem crazy to us, and they seem crazy particularly because they came from extremely erudite scientists that achieved remarkable things in their field. But it shows how, with a very limited set of data, people began speculating about life on other planets. And I should say that these speculations are also a warning from the past, a warning about being too optimistic in astrobiology. And we should be careful today in learning the lessons from our forebears about over-speculation with very little data. Even in the 20th century, speculation runs riot. Percival Lowell, an astronomer who observed lines across the surface of Mars, an optical processing trick of the human brain, which he interpreted to be canals built by a desiccated, dying civilization on Mars, trying to channel water from the polar ice caps to the equatorial regions of Mars. And he observed these canals over and over again, and so convinced was he wrote this: "Every opposition has added to the assurance that the canals are artificial, both by disclosing their peculiarities better and better and by removing generic doubts as to the planet's habitability." The first person really to connect habitability with intelligence on a planet in our own solar system. We now know, of course, there are no canals on Mars. Percival Lowell was deluded by his observations, but it shows that even in the 20th century, people thought there might be intelligences on other planets in our solar system. Aliens still grip the human imagination. You only have to watch films produced by Hollywood and other